Ukraine was supposed to lose the skies. Outgunned, outnumbered, and armed with aging Soviet jets, its air force was expected to collapse in days when Russia invaded. Instead, Ukraine pulled off a stunning reversal. Not by matching Russia plane for plane, but by building a new kind of air power from the ground up. A nationwide drone network, homemade weapons, Western fighter jets adapted faster than anyone thought possible. And now in 2025, that sky power is finally breaking Russia's back. Let's dive into how Ukraine transformed from a grounded underdog into a rising aerial giant, rewriting the rules of war along the way. It might sound surprising, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine inherited the world's third or fourth largest air force, depending on who you asked, divided between two separate branches of the former Soviet Army, the Air Force, and the Air Defense Forces. Their start as an independent nation saw them in possession of 2,000 aircraft, including fighters, strategic bombers, and sophisticated support systems, all of which were the pinnacle of Soviet technology, albeit from the late 1980s. Nonetheless, numbers-wise, only the US, Russia, and China were ahead in aerial power, although China's rank was debatable. But like so many post-Soviet militaries, Ukraine's air force fell victim to decades of neglect, budget cuts, and the painful reality of maintaining complex Soviet-era equipment without Russian support. By the time the 2010s rolled in, Ukraine surrendered, sold off, or returned 60% of its aircraft. This was all in an effort to pay the country's rising debts or meet non-aggression agreements with none other than Russia, known as the Budapest Memorandum, which also included returning substantial nuclear warhead reserves left in Ukraine by Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those same agreements would end up being broken anyway by 2014. At that point, Ukraine had roughly 200 combat aircraft in active service in its fleet and had made negligible progress on updating them from their 1990s configurations. Ukraine's Air Force leadership quickly acknowledged that most of the country's fighter jets would become non-viable by 2030, a sobering admission that foreshadowed the desperate situation Ukraine would face when Russia launched its full-scale invasion. The seeds of Ukraine's current air power transformation were actually planted much earlier than most people realize. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and began its hybrid war in eastern Ukraine, Ukrainian military leaders understood they were facing an existential threat that required fundamental changes. Ukraine's effort to quell the Russian-driven separatist movements within the country also led to it losing practically half of its existing air force within a single year, dropping its aircraft fleet size to just over 200. It was one of the biggest wartime losses of Air Force equipment of the 21st century at the time. Furthermore, the rest of the fleet was either damaged or in various states of disrepair, prompting rounds upon rounds of reviews and attempts at piecing together working planes and helicopters from salvaged parts. Following Russia's 2014 invasion, the Ukrainian Air Force launched an improvised effort to get as many jets as possible in working condition and called up maximum numbers of Air Force reservists in a bid to make the UAF as combat-ready as possible. More importantly, this crisis marked the beginning of Ukraine's pivot toward NATO training methods and Western military thinking, which would later be partially responsible for its success in the war. When 2020 came, Ukraine's best Air Force assets were two understrength fighter brigades comprised of approximately 50 Su-27 flankers, equivalent to the US F-15C. Around 30 were believed to be operational at the beginning of 2025. The situation was even more challenging when considering that Ukraine had no key air defense capabilities such as airborne early warning and control, aerial refueling tankers, digital data link terminals to network these, modern smart munitions, air-launched cruise missiles, or reconnaissance and targeting pods. This wasn't just about having old planes. Ukraine was missing entire categories of capabilities that modern air forces consider essential. The reason for the lack of modernization is a complex topic that requires delving into pre-war geopolitics and economics, but is best succinctly described as stemming from a few main sources. One, the country's existing fleet was still entirely Soviet-era and Soviet-sourced tech, which wasn't manufactured domestically within Ukraine, and Russia refused to sell more jets to a country it planned to invade. Secondly, Ukraine had a terrible diplomatic and economic track record throughout the 2000s. Successive governments swapped between pro- and anti-European stances, all while having some of the worst corruption rates in the world. The lack of funding directly segues into the third reason, as Ukraine's military budget before the war was much lower than you'd expect from its size and historical context, with estimates of the overall budget of the defense ministry being around $1.72 billion. At that point, Ukraine couldn't even buy modern jets, as only a few of them would result in the country stretching its budget despite selling Soviet-era jets in the first place. Fourthly, the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine meant that NATO countries, which were the sole producers of Western jets, were wary of selling contemporary aircraft to Ukraine after 2014 for fear of provoking Russia, as Europe was heavily dependent on Russian gas exports at the time, among other things. Ironically, the Atlantic Council published a report in 2021 that suggested that keeping Ukraine's air force weak through lack of upgrades was one of the key reasons it was on Russia's radar for continued aggression. So Ukraine was in a bit of a catch-22. Getting upgrades could deter Russia from attacking, but Ukraine was too poor to buy upgrades, and signing military procurement deals with NATO to do so, which would take years to finalize, could prompt Russia to attack. All of this ended up being moot by February 2022 as Russia attacked anyway, but that's also where the story takes an unexpected turn. Ukraine's air force found itself outgunned and outnumbered by roughly 9-1 in terms of operational aircraft. Russia also spent the previous 20 years improving on Soviet designs, resulting in aircraft that were an entire generation ahead in terms of electronics, navigation systems, and performance, at least on paper. Because of this, Russian war plan is expected to achieve air superiority within days. Instead, Ukraine essentially bypassed the traditional path to air power entirely. Rather than trying to match Russia plane for plane, Ukraine centered on controlling the skies over its own airspace through an emerging technology: drones. The transformation began with desperation and creativity in equal measure. When the war in Ukraine started, Ukraine used donated drones as well as heavily relied on importing technology and paying for it from NATO donations. Fast forward several years into the war, and the country is on target to produce 4.5 million drones this year. Think about that number for a moment. 4 million drones in 1 year means Ukraine will be making more than 10,000 drones every single day. Ukraine created a distributed network of over 500 suppliers, ranging from major companies to literal garage workshops, all while under the pressure of daily bombardments and escalating threats from Russia. These aren't traditional defense contractors working in billion-dollar facilities. They're entrepreneurs, engineers, and volunteers setting up production lines in basements, abandoned buildings, and makeshift factories. One of the first boosts for the lackluster Air Force was FPV, or first-person view drones, as they functioned as short-range aerial control units that would provide limited air superiority lower to the ground. They were imported into Ukraine as early as June 2022 by the volunteer military unit Signum. After that, the drones practically became hallmarks of Ukraine's ingenuity. With each passing month, kamikaze FPV drones became more effective or gained an additional function that complemented or even supplanted traditional air forces and mechanized infantry. Russia deployed similar drones, leading to a back-and-forth struggle to deliver the next big upgrade in the FPV drone space to overcome countermeasures, improve reliability, or pack more punch. The continued pressure propelled the country's drone industry, leading to small suppliers trying to one-up each other or combine forces to provide a better product for Ukraine's emergent forces. This led to an enormous production spike. In early 2024, Ukraine was producing about 20,000 FPV drones per month. By the end of that same year, they'd ramped up to 200,000 per month. That's a tenfold increase in production capacity in less than 12 months, an unprecedented growth in modern times. The tactical impact of this drone revolution has been nothing short of devastating for Russian forces. Ukrainian FPV drones typically cost around $2,000, yet they are fully capable of destroying Russian tanks worth millions of dollars. But the strategic implications of Ukraine's drone-first approach extend far beyond individual victories against small targets like tanks or infantry, as short-range drones were just the stopgap. Long-range drones, like the Turkish Bayraktar TB2, which was hailed as Ukraine's savior in the opening months of the war, would end up reducing Ukraine's reliance on a traditional air force in the end. To back this up, we only have to look at one notable statistic. By early 2025, drones were accounting for 60 to 70% of the damage and destruction caused to Russian equipment. Ukraine's improvised air power was actually more effective at degrading Russian military capabilities than traditional forces. This is largely attributed to Ukraine being able to systematically expand the geographic reach of its operations, creating a series of benchmark achievements that progressively brought the war deeper into Russian territory. The early Ukrainian long-range drones, such as the UJ-22, could initially strike targets up to 500 miles away, a range that allowed attacks on military installations near the Russian border, but left most of Russia's strategic infrastructure safely beyond Ukrainian reach. By 2024, Ukrainian engineers had pushed this boundary to over 600 miles, enabling strikes on targets deep within traditionally secure Russian territory. This allowed Ukraine to launch persistent attacks on munitions depots or vital supply lines that were running from the country's north and east to the front lines. Furthermore, it meant that Moscow was now within range of long-range strikes, and attacks in late August and September on the capital region generated significant buzz among NATO officials. Ukraine being able to directly threaten the Russian capital gave NATO the incentive to allow the use of expensive and devastating long-range missile donations outside of Ukrainian territory. Suddenly, the prospect of sending German Taurus missiles to Ukraine meant they could now target vital reinforced infrastructure pieces like bridges and shelters, as the Taurus is one of the few weapons that can pierce hardened targets. In effect, every piece of progress on Ukraine's drone capabilities gave NATO confidence that it was investing in Ukraine as a way to directly defeat Russia rather than simply borrowing time. But the true breakthrough came when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky revealed in 2025 that domestically produced drones could now be operated from a range of 2,000 kilometers or 1,242 miles, essentially covering all Russian territory where strategic objects exist, since beyond that distance lies only the Siberian wilderness and forest. The now famous Operation Spiderweb required Ukraine's intelligence services to plan for 18 months to hit Russian strategic bomber bases, with the bases being up to 3,000 miles away and storing 40 Russian strategic bombers. This was a monumental task. The drones were technically short-range drones, but smuggling them via trucks, using the internet to launch them, and then relying on AI and inertial guidance to send them through the last few miles to the target meant that the entire operation was performed all under Russia's radar. Spiderweb was quickly dubbed one of the turning points of the war, as Russia lost a swath of its nuclear warfare delivery systems in one fell swoop to a country that didn't have intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were previously believed to be the only real way to target distant military compounds without detection or repercussion. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign has also unearthed another aspect of economic warfare that ties into the success of small, mobile units over fielding a fleet of aircraft. Ukraine's campaign of drone strikes in early 2025 focused on Russian energy infrastructure and knocked out around 1/10 of Russia's oil refining capacity. This meant that Ukraine had systematically been able to target the economic foundations of Russia's war machine. The range of targets suggests a well-planned Ukrainian campaign to methodically dismantle Russia's energy infrastructure, with Ukrainian drones striking at least 8 Russian refineries, along with numerous oil depots, pumping stations, and ports used for oil and gas exports. The production numbers for all drones tell an even more extraordinary story when viewed in context. In 2023, Ukraine produced around 800,000 drones across all categories. By 2024, this had increased to 2 million drones. But Ukraine's 2025 projections called for over 5 million drones to be produced and procured within that year, suggesting more than twice the year-over-year growth of an industry being basically created out of thin air. To put this in perspective, NATO missile procurement typically involves only hundreds of units annually or thousands in exceptional years. The difference in scale is a fundamental paradigm shift from precision manufacturing of expensive systems to mass production of expendable but highly effective weapons. The artificial intelligence integration in long-range systems represents a quantum leap in warfare capabilities. During strategic bomber operations, drones that lose communication links with Ukrainian operators automatically switch to AI-guided navigation along pre-programmed routes. Upon reaching their designated targets, the AI systems identify specific aircraft types, calculate optimal attack angles, and trigger explosive payloads without human intervention. This level of complexity means Ukrainian drones can complete strategic missions with minimal oversight, greatly diminishing the operating costs and risks of each strike. The strategic impact measurements provide compelling evidence of Ukraine's success in redefining long-range warfare. Russia launched more than 19,000 missiles and over 14,700 one-way attack drones at Ukrainian targets from September 2022 through December 2024, representing massive resource expenditure with limited strategic effect. In contrast, Ukraine's significantly smaller number of long-range strike drones achieved a disproportionate impact by targeting high-value infrastructure, strategic weapon systems, and economic choke points. The destruction of a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet in a single swoop was just the cherry on top, as it confirmed that Ukraine had developed weaponry that Russia couldn't reliably counter. Ukraine had essentially solved its numerical disadvantage by creating an entirely new category of air warfare, one that emphasized quantity, adaptability, and cost-effectiveness over traditional metrics like speed and payload capacity. However, that didn't mean that Ukraine wouldn't accept conventional air systems. After all, drones don't have the same presence as a fleet of fighter jets that descends and bombards a military base or mows down mechanized infantry. While Ukraine was revolutionizing warfare through drones, it also bought enough time, media presence, and diplomatic goodwill to influence NATO into providing more robust donation packages. NATO finally pulled through in 2024 with the first shipment of F-16s from the Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark. Ukraine's pilots had spent months training both inside the country and abroad to get acquainted with the new systems, while the jets themselves took their first flights from Ukrainian airfields in August 2024. The F-16 Fighting Falcon quickly became the cornerstone of Ukraine's renewed air forces. even though these weren't cutting-edge aircraft by contemporary standards. The aircraft that Ukraine received from NATO were made in the 1980s and 90s and received the so-called Midlife Update, or MLU, before they were considered for complete decommissioning by their native countries. Despite their age, these aircraft brought capabilities that Ukraine's Soviet-era fleet simply couldn't match. For example, the F-16's AN/ALQ-131 electronic countermeasures pods proved invaluable. These systems jammed and confused Russian radar systems by creating shadows, echoes, or false images that made targeting the aircraft much more difficult. The effectiveness of these F-16s exceeded even optimistic projections. On December 13, 2024, a young Ukrainian F-16 pilot accomplished what no one had done before, downing 6 Russian cruise missiles in a single sortie. 4 were destroyed using air-to-air missiles, while remarkably, the pilot eliminated 2 additional missiles, using only the aircraft's M61A1 6-barrel cannon. This achievement was particularly significant because Russia had launched a massive aerial assault, deploying nearly 200 drones alongside 93 cruise missiles and hypersonic Kinzhal weapons. France's contribution of Mirage 2000 fighters added another layer to Ukraine's air defense network. The Mirage 2000s were deployed alongside F-16s in March 2025 to counter a massive Russian strike involving 70 missiles and approximately 200 long-range drones. Zelensky specifically praised the Mirage pilots who successfully intercepted multiple cruise missiles during this engagement. The strategic value of having both F-16s and Mirage 2000s operating simultaneously became clear when military analysts realized that by deploying 2 different aircraft models with diverging electronics, Ukraine could leverage different electronic warfare systems operating on varied frequencies. Russia would be forced to develop counter-strategies at a much faster pace, which would reduce their effectiveness and allow NATO to provide a prompt response by updating the systems. The integration of Swedish Saab 340 AWC 890 airborne early warning aircraft represented the final piece of Ukraine's air defense puzzle. Featuring an advanced electronically scanned array radar mounted atop the commercial aircraft hull, the Saab could track multiple aerial and maritime targets at distances of up to 250 miles. This capability addressed one of Ukraine's most critical vulnerabilities, early warning against Russian glide bomb attacks, which became increasingly frequent and devastating. What makes Ukraine's integration of these Western aircraft so remarkable is how Ukraine managed to extract maximum effectiveness from what are essentially aging platforms. Yes, F-16s might offer improved capabilities compared to Ukraine's Soviet-era fleet, but they would need to be replaced in perhaps 4 to 6 years based on accrued flight hours. Meanwhile, F-16 foreign military sales to Bulgaria and Slovakia put the cost of these aging fighters, of which Ukraine had an estimated 90, at around $200 million per aircraft, representing a large singular investment. Yet Ukrainian pilots achieved success rates that far exceed what NATO forces expected. This transformation has forced NATO's strategists to confront an uncomfortable reality about contemporary warfare. Traditional metrics of military power relied on the number of tanks, the sophistication of individual weapon systems, and the size of defense budgets. Russia consistently ranked as number 2 in global military power scalings, just after the US, and yet when push came to shove and Russia actually initiated a war, it failed to quickly capture a country that was by all accounts a shell of its former Soviet self. Ukraine's success suggests that future conflicts will be won by forces that can rapidly adapt, innovate, and scale the production of smaller, more numerous systems, rather than relying on expensive, complex platforms that take years to develop and deploy. The implications of this shift are profound and extend to some of the most lauded military systems in the world. NATO's advanced systems like Patriot missile batteries and HIMARS rocket systems, while individually impressive, have struggled to match the cost-effectiveness of Ukraine's drone-based approach. After all, Patriot is designed to launch a multi-million-dollar interceptor missile at a multi-billion-dollar ballistic weapon, not blasting cheap and abundant drones and glide bombs out of the sky. Similarly, HIMARS missiles are gated behind how much of them NATO can produce above keeping its internal supply, as that's how donations are structured, since Ukraine doesn't produce them. Even then, the drone deployment systems are practically dirt cheap compared to HIMARS launchers and can be moved and removed whenever and wherever needed. There are likely less than 50 HIMARS systems in Ukraine, making them a proverbial drop in the bucket when compared to how many drones are being deployed daily from both sides of the conflict. Perhaps most telling is how other major powers have responded to Ukraine's innovations. The United States initiated the Replicator program, which was supposedly aimed at countering China's drone and air force capabilities. However, the actual reason for its existence is right there in the name, replicating Ukraine's success in distributed manufacturing of low-cost, high-yield drone systems. NATO established a joint NATO-Ukraine Joint Analysis Training and Education Center in Poland, inviting Ukrainian developers to improve upon Europe's aging military concepts. Meanwhile, the People's Liberation Army, a fancy name for China's military, completely restructured its Strategic Support Force into 3 branches that would develop the same drone electronic warfare operations that Ukraine has perfected. Countries that had spent decades perfecting expensive, sophisticated weapon systems are now trying to learn lessons from Ukraine, which opened the war facing predictions it would fall in 3 days. And this trend shows no signs of slowing, as each news report comes in with another novel way Ukraine has utilized its limited aerial capabilities. When all is said and done, Ukraine has continued to advocate for more fighter jet and aircraft donations to Ukraine. Zelensky claimed back in 2024 that more than 120 F-16s would be a good start to fill the country's holes in air defense systems. The combined numbers of F-16s and Mirage 2000s they had acquired by mid-2025 barely went over 100, and that was before Russia started mass using glide bombs, which are uniquely positioned to require jets and traditional anti-air defenses for complete protection. European countries seem more united than ever before to commit to that assistance, which gives hope that Ukraine will force Russia to approach peace talks or risk losing even more men and equipment. Thanks for watching, and subscribe to The Military Show for more in-depth analysis of global geopolitics.